When history's tectonic plates slip and the old order is carried away by an earthquake of popular resentment, we know we are witnessing revolution. Such events have thrown up some of history's towering figures, but many didn't take over until long after the old regime had fallen. Mao wrote, "A revolution is not a dinner party," and he was really underlining the degree to which overthrowing a long-established autocracy or a tyrannical police state required the mobilization of huge numbers of people and upheaval on a genuinely epic scale. Where that hasn't happened, generally revolutions have failed if their base is too narrow in particular, and the successful ones all seem to involve the mobilization of the professional classes, or as the Marxists would have called them, the bourgeoisie. Lenin's October Revolution in Russia followed another one 8 months earlier. It had brought a very different type of government to power, one far more acceptable to the middle class. While those that Lenin dubbed the useful idiots of Alexander Kerensky's provisional government faced one crisis after another, the Bolsheviks prepared to seize power. A similar thing happened in Iran after the return from exile of Ayatollah Khomeini. When he arrived, many underestimated his appeal. Iran had other contenders for power too, including communists and nationalists. Abdul Hassan Banisadr, an educated secular professional, became the leader after the fall of the Shah. But the cleric's power grew, and 18 months later Banisadr lost a power struggle with the religious leadership and was sent into exile. The overthrow of the old autocracy is just the first act, of course. The weak central government that usually follows can be buffeted or overwhelmed by all sorts of different forces. Conservatives might rally and suffocate the revolution. Someone might appear, perhaps a military leader like Napoleon, who diverts it and seizes power, taking the whole thing in a different direction. Or a conspiratorial minority can elbow aside those it's been in alliance with and seize power for itself. In all of these scenarios, the danger is that it becomes revolution in the true sense and goes back to where it started, with a new repressive regime. Although Russia and Iran provide obvious examples of the most organised and ruthless taking over, some other revolutions have suffered a less dramatic fate, but a troubling one nevertheless. Ukraine's Orange Revolution broke out in 2004.
Залишаємося з тими бандитами. Я вас прошу, друзі.
Massive protests against a rigged election resulted in a rerun and success for Viktor Yushchenko, the reformist candidate.
Подяка людська.
But last year he lost power to his old opponent, the man regarded by many democracy activists as representing the old elite or forces of conservatism, and he promptly declared the Orange Revolution to be at an end. You say you got a real solution, well, you know. The lesson of so many revolutions from 1789 onwards is that a series of national convulsions may well take place before a stable system emerges, and even then it may well not be a democratic one. Egyptians will be lucky if they escape years of upheaval and revolutionary violence.
Well, with us now in the studio, Simon Sebag Montefiore, the author of Jerusalem, the biography, and Dr. Marwa Dawoodi from the Middle East Centre at Oxford University, and we're joined from New York by the historian Simon Sharma. Simon Sebag Montefiore, it seems to me, looking at that and seeing what's happening in Cairo, the only certainty here is that there's great uncertainty about where it's all going to end.
Yeah, I mean, so many revolutions end up somewhere completely different than they begin, and the best of intentions at the beginning have very little effect on the fate of the revolution at the end. I mean, I think what matters in revolutions is, of course, the will of the people, but organisation increasingly tells, and that's usually the most decisive thing. The initial spontaneous excitement, which is extremely thrilling, involves many young people, students. If you look at the revolutions in 1830, 1848, 1917, these are often spontaneous, disorganized, and the very fact that they're leaderless and partyless gives them an incredible asymmetric strength. But then, ultimately, organisation counts. And the organisations that we know count in Egypt so far are the army and possibly the only sort of organised opposition party, the Muslim Brotherhood.
Simon Sharma, there is a vacuum at the top of this movement of dissent, as far as we can see in Cairo. That can't last, can it?
No, it certainly can't, not if this particular revolution is to achieve its aims of a new constitutional nationalism for Egypt. As the real Simon just said, it's essential somehow for popular euphoria and the organisation of that seemingly least revolutionary institution, committees, to kind of come together. On the one hand, you do need some sort of provisional revolutionary committee, even if their own nostrums are going to be thrown away as the revolution goes on. Or else it just becomes a kind of formless euphoria. Actually, the events in Cairo, extremely moving as they are, have begun to generate, it seems to me, some sense of revolutionary tactics. The move out of Tahrir Square, which was turning into a sort of self-organised prison in some ways, towards the siege of the Parliament building, suggests that there is some sort of notional sense that you need to press the tactics on, even to get short-term concessions. Long-term is much trickier.
Dr. Dawoodi, the most organised force in Egypt is the military. It's been at the heart, has it not, of Egyptian public life, certainly since the revolution, 50 years or more. That is going to be the force that ends up in charge, isn't it?
The army is decisive in Egyptian politics, and so far the army has shown that it was not taking sides. But one has to say the top leadership in the army is very close to the Mubarak ruling elite. They have benefited politically, but also economically. There's all of an economic complex there, which the top officers have been in ties with the Mubarak elite, Mubarak regime elite. So now the question is, the army, clearly the role of the army is decisive. Will they sit back, as we've seen in the past? But I would go beyond the sentimental image that we've seen as the army colluding with the protesters. They also have an interest in keeping the situation stable.
Do you consider what's happening there to be a revolution?
I do consider it as a revolution. It's a massive popular protest. I have to say, there are exhilarating effects of that massive popular protest throughout the Arab world. It's the first time that the Egyptian people, since 60 years, have broken the chains of fear. They have dared to go to the streets, to grab the streets, to confront the army, to confront the tanks, to confront mainly, I would say, the security apparatus. And they kept on being determined. They were not deterred by the fact that 300 protesters were killed. So I do consider it as a revolution. If you define revolution with an objective to overthrow the political system and to implement a new system.
Now, Simon, you've mentioned that it's the best organised force which generally takes the initiative, takes control, and
oftentimes oftentimes it's a sort of shrink, that the revolution shrinks, so that the base, it's not as a base, but a tighter and tighter organisation with less and less, more radical people becomes the most effective force in a revolution. And that's happened in so many examples, of course, in Russia. But that's one danger. That's one huge danger. That a very tightly organised, small group of people, the hard men, start to prosper. As chaos spreads, the tough people, take control, and that, of course, is what's happened in Iran, happened in Russia, and it could happen here too, I think.
The question that arises for go on, Simon Sharma, what have you got to say on this then?
Well, it's tempting to say that this Egyptian revolution has an uphill struggle, because most of the experience of the 20th century certainly always ended up in various kinds of military dictatorship or party dictatorship backed by an army. But the two great driving forces, it seems to me, of modern revolution, which seem to be disconnected, but I think they're really not. First of all, indeed, the army's identification, or someone's identification, with nationalism. The key phrase from Whewell yesterday was Egypt above all else. If someone who is not the Muslim Brethren can actually grab onto that, there being a long history of the Egyptian army representing national rebirth, going all the way back to the rebellions of 1882, then that actually is a big jump forward. It depends on a split in the army command. Somebody, some Bonaparte-like figure, taking a bet that he can command popular enthusiasm to press the cause of the nation forward. The other point, I promise to be quick, is storytelling, something that, that Simon Sebag Montefiore and I are interested in. Weirdly, a story of martyrs and sacrifices and ordinary people needs to be told. And the genuinely novel thing, as it's often been said, is that through Facebook and through television and through social media, storytelling can get out there. We saw how it dramatically increased the numbers in the streets just yesterday. You put storytelling together with some figure in the army, not too close to Mubarak, who wants to say, I and the people together will be the real Egypt, and then you have a future for the revolution which is not simply playing into the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood.
We're going to explore a little bit of that a little bit later in the programme, but for the rest of us, of course, who are not in Egypt, the question is, what is the most constructive, what is likely to be the most positive response on the part of other countries? Now, in revolutions generally, once other countries start messing around, it tends to have an effect, doesn't it?
Well, in Russia there was intervention by all the Western powers, which failed, of course. And that, I mean, I think one of the things here is this is Egypt for Egyptians. And I think there's a huge danger in America, particularly, dictating to them and telling them what their government should be.
Well, one does wonder what people would make in this country of Hosni Mubarak running around telling us how we should order our affairs.
Exactly. I mean, I think we've got to be very careful of that, and there's a real danger there could be a huge anti-Western backlash if we're not extremely careful.
Simon Sharma, do you think of 1979 in this context and Iran?
A little bit. It's certainly true that xenophobia is the elixir of militancy, of radicalism. I mean, Barack Obama is playing it in a very ginger way, and it's important that he does. He knows full well that nothing would deliver the revolution, essentially, to the most radical elements, most militant Islamic elements in particular, than any sort of sense of heaviness. His real task, Jeremy, it seems to me, is to make sure that the Israelis keep their cool in that respect, especially since there are dodgy things happening on the Sinai frontier. I do think, and I don't know what your other guest who knows about Egypt far more expertly than I do thinks, but it does seem to me that a huge difference is that in respect of 1979, you had this extraordinary story of Khomeini coming back from Paris. You had this sense of a political clergy just up and raring to go to sweep away the Rafsanjanis and the rest of the kind of self-appointed intelligentsia. You really don't have that in Egypt, and you have a much more complicated balance between the Muslim clergy and other elements in the opposition. That's a
right.
good sign.
Let me explore that a little with Dr. Daoudi here. I mean, do you share that analysis? The comparison 1979, of course, the Americans wished the Shah to be more democratic, and they got Islamic fundamentalist government.
I mean, the alliance with the Shah is a bit the same alliance that the Americans have had with the Egyptian government, with Mubarak's regime. I think the analogy with the Iranian Revolution is not relevant in this case, in the sense that Khomeini had a very much stronger spiritual power and legitimacy within the population than the current Muslim Brotherhood. And again, this threat which has been put forth since a few weeks about the risk of Brotherhood-led new government, I think this is not going to happen. The Muslim Brotherhood will be part of some new political system. Clearly, they're the official opposition, but one has to say, why have they been strengthened in the last 3 years? Because the Mubarak regime is seen as a secular system, which has been backed by America. Clearly, the foreign rent sent by America has allowed Mubarak to sustain its regime, to buy its loyalties, and also to maintain an oppressive regime. And therefore, the people turned to religion because they were countering a secular system. If there is a clear democratic system with real institutions, transparent elections, the people would find no need to turn to the Muslim Brotherhood. And by the way, there are also other opposition parties in Egypt.
Do you think the West is right to believe that the inevitable end point in all of this is a proper functioning democracy?
I do believe so. In any case, I think it's up to the Egyptian people to decide their own fate. And I think the Americans now should, they've changed the discourse a little bit, but they should really like adapt their Middle East policy to their values, I mean to the discourse. And in that sense, backing so-called moderate allies